Won't you lend your lungs to me? Mine are collapsing. Plant my feet and bitterly breathe up the time that's passed. Breath I'll take and breath I'll give. Pray the day's not poised. Stand among the ones that live in lonely indecision.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 18 of the Crackpot Podcast with James LaFond and Lynn Lockhart. And we're taping on November 16th. Good morning, James. How are you?
Good morning, Lynn. I'm doing okay. I just enjoyed watching Uncle Joe Biden on video, feeling up everybody from a female toddler to a 300-pound state trooper guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's just as creepy as you would think he was.
Yeah, he has casts a wide net with his creepiness.
Well, I think that there's a tactical aspect behind having a vice president such as that. You know, that's kind of job security.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, if you want to keep the right from getting rid of you, you have a creep like that. If you want to keep the left from getting rid of you, you get a muscular Christian ready to fight the end time war of 3 million souls in the Middle East. You know?
Well, to tell the listeners, we are talking about the video that there's actually hours and hours of this video, C-SPAN video, basically, of Joe Biden just taking advantage of his position to grope mostly young girls, but also middle-aged women, the occasional grandma, and some men along the way. This is getting some traction now. These last weeks have started with kind of Harvey Weinstein and just has seen an avalanche of these things becoming public. Oh. And I saw this video of Joe back during the election. I thought it was common knowledge. It came up in my video feed, but apparently not.
The one girl was obviously uncomfortable, the one that, the thin girl with the brown hair. Yeah,
she's got a red V-neck dress on, and she wasn't comfortable at all.
The shoulder thing only got creepy when he seemed to be pressing the little girl like up against his thighs and not letting her walk away when she wanted to.
Right.
The thing where he's standing behind them and he slides his arm around their lower back and the hand comes out between the hip and the breast on the ribs there. Mm. I have only done that with women that I've already had sex with. I don't know how I am as far as touching compared to normal people, but if I'm going to do that, yeah, that's not touching a sexual organ, yeah. But that's not a way that I've touched anybody that I wasn't absolutely certain wanted me touching them in other places.
All right. Yeah, it's an intimate way of touching someone, and it makes these girls really uncomfortable. You can see it right away.
I wonder if he's got cold, sweaty hands.
Oh, jeez.
Or they can feel the sweat soaking through their pretty little sweaters.
Yeah, that's awful.
Yeah, it's good old. We had Aqualung as vice president for 8 years. I think that's fantastic. I'd like to say something in Uncle Joe's defense.
What's that?
Well, I noticed that he also had his left hand on a knee of the state trooper that was twice his size.
Yeah.
And 20 years younger than him.
Yeah.
Once, I went down to the martial arts supply place to buy sticks with a new stick fighter that I was training, a handsome, copper-skinned, muscular young fellow. And we stopped in a bar next door. This is in swanky Federal Hill. And they've got there's a $5 beer or $5 soda that you can get in the middle of the day. And the bartender was a little bit, not real masculine. And we were the only people in there. And I was supposed to meet Megan at a bar that Arik was going to drop me off at. But we ended up in this place, in the martial arts supply place, a half hour longer than we were supposed to. So she calls me and she said, I'm already at this bar and these creepy guys are staring at me and I'm just not going to stay here for long if you're not going to get out of here. And I always had a habit with her whenever I needed to calm her down to put my hand on her knee, especially if we're sitting next to each other. And that's what I do. I'm trying to calm her down with my voice, and my hand automatically goes to Eric's knee. And I'm kind of like petting it because, like I did with her, and he's looking at me and his eyes are popping out, and the gay dude behind the bar is looking at us here. I got a gray beard and got this handsome 30-year-old guy here and of color, and so I look like this. I look like I belong in the neighborhood, actually. So, and then we both looked down at my hand, and I'm like, "Oh, dude, sorry." I went to explain. He said, "I know what you were doing." He said you were trying to smooth things over with the girl you're talking to. So I figured it was probably a reflex. He said if a guy like you was actually into dudes, people would know about it. It would have gotten around. I wouldn't have brought to you for training. So maybe Uncle Joe's just trying to calm that big heifer of a state trooper down.
Yeah, could be that. I tend to think that he's trying to deflect, or like he's trying to build this reputation as just a huggy, touchy kind of guy. And if your daughter says, "Mom, why do you hug me so much?" "Oh, he hugs everybody," something like that. So I see it as cover for all the groping that he does anyway.
Okay, that's reasonable. I might charge you with some cynicism there.
Oh, you haven't seen all you've seen is the 3-minute video.
Well, there's clear evidence there that Uncle Joe is so creepy when he touches little girls that your daughters just flipped out when they saw the video that you had pulled up on your computer screen. That's what it sounded like to me.
Yeah, that's probably exactly why. Okay, well, what I really wanted to ask you was, what do you think of the parents in this video? Because I think any reasonable person can agree that Biden is a creep. So what do you think of the dads, particularly Jeff Sessions, who seemed to be the only person who knew what was going on and was willing to repel the aggressor here?
Well, that guy, Mr. Sessions, obviously knows what it is to be a man. The other men would probably get on their knees and perform oral sex on Joe Biden if it would get them what they wanted. So I don't really expect much out of most political types. They're going to, they're psychologically, they're whores. So I wouldn't expect them to show any protective instincts. What you saw on the face of the parents was this extreme need to make sure their mask was perfect, and that they were all worried about the photo. So it is perfect cover for him. They probably didn't see a lot of what was going on with him. They're looking where they're supposed to at the photo.
Yeah.
So I just don't think there's any protective instincts there. Most people don't think that they should have to walk their wife to the car in the middle of the night.
Right.
I have a lady friend who I dated many years ago that I still keep in touch with, and she got rid of me because she could tell I was on a course I wasn't going to make the money that she wanted, and she calls me up when she gets to work early in the morning just because she knows that I care if she made it, and it makes her feel good that somebody at least cares, because her sons and her husband won't even walk her to her car in Baltimore City at 3:00 in the morning when the hunt is on.
Wow.
I was proud of my son. I told him a while ago, I said, you got to walk your wife to her car. I know you have your own little parking pad, but you've had car thefts in the area at the same time that she goes to work. You got to go out there with her. And he did. And he actually ended up having a run-in with a near run-in with a couple of dindus that came up on his porch.
Oh, wow.
As soon as he went inside. So that wasn't hard for me to spark protective instincts in my son. That made me feel good. So I think that comes more from his mother than from me. because most people in my family just think I'm insane. But his mother, his mother believes that men should protect women, and I'm sure she inculcated that in him.
I think you probably have a much larger influence than you're admitting, but
I don't believe in many things. I believe that most of the politicians that rule the Western world are pedophiles. They're predators. They're people whose whole life is dedicated to having absolute control, as absolute as can be gotten, over others with no skin in the game, with no risk at all. These are people that want to control men. They want to control war-fighting men. They want to control fighter planes and aircraft carriers just by pulling strings behind the scenes and smiling at a camera. I'm sure there's many children that have been lent to senior politicians by junior politicians. Some of these people might even have these children just so they can dress them up and put on a family show when they go out there, and then they'll spend the children however they need to be spent. If they need to pimp them out, whatever. That's something I believe. I don't have evidence for that, but I just believe that psychologically what Anne Rice was writing about in her vampire novels was about the people that govern us. Just this soul-eating group of people that are essentially fiends.
Well, I'll tell you that it gets easier and easier to believe as you see videos like this, and as more and more reports are surfacing about how these guys really behave. And for some reason, I don't know why, it's becoming okay to tell the stories or to acknowledge the stories. Every day there's somebody new. Today it's Al Franken. There's actually pictures of him. Yeah.
Yeah, he seems like the kind of guy that would have targeted an altar boy or whatever the secular. What's the secular version of the altar boy?
Oh, I don't know.
What's it, a court page? No, it's not a page. What is it? Some kind of intern, I bet.
Yeah. Well, he's actually groping a woman in the picture. But...
Oh, well, good. Okay, I approve of that. I mean, because I really have my doubts about him.
Yeah.
So for him, I would make an exception. At least he got himself admitted back into the gender he came from.
Yeah, well, still not very good behavior.
This was even a subject at the bar with Mescaline Franklin and Big Ron the other night.
Oh, really?
An older, smaller fellow, even smaller than me, came over, and he had just cracked open a beer and then discovered that he had someplace to go. And he brought his just opened beer over, and he asked us if any of us would want it. He just wanted to give it away, didn't want to waste it. And Mescaline and I were a little bit suspicious. Ron reached over my shoulder. He said, "I'll take that, buddy." And then he knocks back part of the beer and he says, "Wow, I hope that wasn't a Harvey Weinstein beer."
Yeah.
Yeah. So you even have people in skanky bars in Baltimore City, which is like the epicenter of the American apocalypse, concerned. And albeit a lighthearted way about all this perversion in high places. It's assumed. I was talking with my friend that's a karate instructor just a couple hours ago about the great number of women that we have known. He brought it up that most of the women that we have known have been beaten and raped by men. And it's kind of unusual to find one that hasn't been. The subject turned towards the mother's solution to this. Some of them have brought their children to his class ahead of time to try to get some instruction on boundaries and and to defend yourself. But I dated two different women who did not date. They told me that they did not date when their daughters were young, until their daughters were 18.
Oh, single moms. Yeah.
Single moms.
Yeah.
They didn't want a man in the house, so they would just.
I agree with that.
Not have any contact with men. And I talked to a couple of women my age who were propositioned by men who dated their mothers. And they were 16, 17 years old.
Yeah.
Now the one lady, her mother didn't believe her. And the other lady, her mother did believe her and just jettisoned the boyfriend just like that.
All right. Well, that's the greatest source of danger for children is mom's boyfriend.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's been since before his.
The anti-male contingent will tell you that it's the man in the child's life or the father, or they'll kind of try to hide that fact that it's not the father. Fathers are actually less likely to harm their children than mothers are, but the most likely person is the man that mom brings in to the house.
Now, I forget, I think Molyneux on one of his things on Bomb in the Brain had the numbers on the ratio of mothers to fathers abusing their children, and I think it was like 2.5 to 1 or something.
Yeah.
It was a lot more than I thought it would be. I thought it would be about even. But the just disastrous number was the number of people who were abused or molested by stepfathers or the boyfriend's mother.
Yeah.
And it didn't seem to make a difference whether it was just a boyfriend or it was a stepfather.
No.
You know, and so I was shocked that was that bad.
Yeah.
I just thought that I had the duty to be extra reserved in my behavior around my adopted son before I adopted him. I just thought that my standard behavior had to be even better because he wasn't biologically mine.
All right.
I don't know if that's valid according to any of the morality systems that you humans have, but it felt like, hey.
Well, it's a child that you don't have authority over, right? It's like if I'm at the playground and some kids are acting strange, I'll go over there and say, hey, talk to them, but I'm not going to do what I would do to my own children, right? There's a different level of authority that you can exercise, so it makes sense to me.
Okay. There has been some prosecutions.
Yeah.
Is there any numbers as far as how many prosecutions have gone up?
I've seen that prosecutions of human trafficking has increased under the Trump administration, but I don't have the numbers handy. But that seems to be the belief, is that something has, I feel, and I don't have the data, but I feel that something is changing. Well, Bill Clinton is getting thrown under the bus now because apparently, to my great sadness, Hillary Clinton really has no hope of the presidency next time around. I was really hoping for her to give it one more shot. But if they're coming out and saying that I believe Bill Clinton's accusers now, 20 years later, 30 years later.
Well, is she saying that?
No, some celebrities are saying it, and a New York Times editorial said it. And
well,
Vox,
everybody knew it was true when the original accusations came out.
Oh, yeah. But now...
yeah, there's just too many bodies in the rearview mirror.
But now it's somehow overnight has become accepted that even Bill Clinton must be jettisoned from polite society.
The fall of Slick Willie.
Yeah. So something is changing. I mean, from Bill Clinton, I could see it just as a fact that Hillary Clinton has no more chances now. The Democratic Party doesn't need her anymore, and the whole Clinton family influence is now in decline. So we can go ahead and throw Bill to the wolves and have that be burnished to our reputation. See, we'll even throw our beloved Bill.
They still have a lot of money, though. The Clinton Foundation's huge.
They do, but they're not collecting money like they used to because they don't have influence to peddle.
Okay. Well, it'll be fascinating to see what ends up becoming of the money. Are you suggesting that the fact that the King of New York is now the King of America has something to do with this increased intolerance for the molestation of the helpless?
Well, the one guy in that video that put a stop to Uncle Joe's creepy behavior, he is now Attorney General. Okay.
Well, it might be him, but he's obviously got the backing of.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. The big guy. Yeah. So who knows what these people know, right? If, like you say, these people are pedophiles or otherwise despicable people. It sure looked like Jeff Sessions knew what Joe was up to there.
It could be that the reason why both sides of the aisle were so rabid against Trump, that they were so intent on not letting him in, it could just be that he's a heterosexual man that likes post-pubescent females.
All right.
And he doesn't have. I was exchanging emails with Baruch about this. He suggested that whether it exists or not, if somebody could come up with a plan that got politicians behind closed doors doing weird things to young children and getting that on film, then that gives you a politician that's basically got a handle for their disposal right on their back.
It's a network of mutual blackmail that they have. That's the idea behind it, is that it's kind of an initiation rite, and then once you've done it once, there's really no excuse. You're on video. You're blackmailable. You're owned for life.
And a certain amount of them have probably just raped one child just to get into the club.
That's the theory.
But there's going to be some that are going to be serial rapists, that are going to be, and I would suggest somebody like Podesta that was even in more power, they're probably going to be hogging it up.
Well, did you see the artwork that those guys have in their homes?
Yeah.
It's disgusting.
Yeah, that was disgusting, but I don't see anything more logical than the supposition that these guys are innocence vampires, that they swim in corruption, and they're going to do what they can to gobble up the tiny bit of innocence that they could temporarily get their hands on.
Right.
I think they're vampires.
Yeah.
You know, with the vampire tradition, you suck the blood out of somebody. Usually they die. You've taken this young, vital person and you just turn them into a sack of drained meat, and then you go on as the vampire. And there was a real, she was a countess or a duchess or a baroness. It was in the Carpathian Mountains, I believe. She was taking baths in the blood of peasant virgins.
Yeah, I think that's Elizabeth Bathory.
They ended up locking her in a tower, but they still wouldn't kill her because she was one of the elite. But she actually denuded. There was no young women left in her district, and it wasn't discovered until she started sending her henchmen to gather up women from somebody else's political district.
Oh.
And that's like cutting the shrubbery and stealing their apples, because those people belong to the land.
Right.
And the land belonged to the Lord.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a real crude example of exactly that.
Well, that kind of brings me to the next topic, which I don't know if you're aware, but there's a strong contingent of monarchists in the alt-right. They believe that democracy has led us down this path of destruction. And they're not wrong about that. But, some of them just propose, like, finding some heir to some obscure throne in Europe and installing him as a monarch, and that's just silly, right? That's not going to work. You put forth your theory of your political theory, which was the hero king, right?
Younger would have called that notion, looking for the hereditary bloodline, he would have called that sentimental, and he had great disdain for sentimentality, for taking a good novel and putting a happily ever under epilogue after it. Mm. And the writers were, at that time when he was writing a science fiction, were under a lot of pressure to have a happily ever after ending. Mm. Philip Jose Farmer rewrote Two Hawks from Earth. It was a dimension travel book, and put a bad ending on it, because the publisher had wanted a good ending, but these two characters he had together, he just knew that they weren't going to work out. So when he got it reprinted under another publisher, they permitted him to write the ending that he wanted. So it's that strong. There's this strong need for this nostalgic, for this idea that something permanent that doesn't have to be tested, it can be found and brought out. And the bloodline's a perfect idea of that. So that's the corrupt, civilized idea of the bloodline. In reality, the bloodline's supposed to be tested, and if it fails, it becomes ash. And if it doesn't fail, then it becomes tempered. So I think that Evola, for instance, would prefer the hero king in cycles and have hereditary, have his line rule until it became decadent, and then you need to have another hero king to roll it over. Yeah. If you have a monarchy, you're going to have ups and downs.
Right.
But the point is, you're going to have some points where you've got a good person that's also dynamic in charge, and then you're going to have low points and mid points. But with a democracy, that's a race to the bottom.
It's just a slide.
That's worship of the lowest common denominator. And it's Theodore Sturgeon was famous for saying that 95% of everything is crap. I definitely think that's true with people. I don't know about other things. I think 95% of steel is pretty good, but 95% of people, that's crap. And the whole democratic idea is built upon the stupid decide, because the stupid will always be the swing vote.
All right, the marginal.
Yeah, because they'll be the most easily swayed.
Yeah. And you have the constant growth of the franchise, right? You start out with the patriarchs, the men who are actually responsible for their families, responsible for their property. And I know that's not popular, right? Because in olden days, that was just landed white men. It wasn't white slaves. It wasn't women. It wasn't blacks. It wasn't any other kind of guy. It was really a small fraction of white men who had the franchise. And just slowly and slowly it grows and grows until nowadays you have Democrats busing illegal immigrants from town to town to vote over and over again. So this voting it's just pretend, really.
The Congregationalists in New England during the Indian Wars in 1676, most of the men made little or no effort to protect their wives and their children. They ran away. There were some of them that were heroes, and they mostly got killed. The men that ran away, the man that wrote this book that I'm referring, Increase Mather, he absolved them. And he cited passages from the Old Testament to the effect that the center of the family is the patriarch. He can always get another wife. He can always have more children. He's the center of the family. And the natives that they were fighting, they would heroically stand and die trying to defend all of their children. And the New Englanders found that it was a great weakness among the Indians that they cared so much for their children, and that they would stand and they would defend their women. And you could take the materialist angle and say, well, they had fewer children and they had fewer women, and their economy was closer to subsistence, and they didn't have surplus. So, you could make that argument, but when it came down to fighting, it was no contest. The whole war was decided by native warriors duking it out. The people that won the war were the Mohegans and the Pequots, and they all had this heroic ideal. That's how they looked at it, and the influence of women at home and the lack of internal violence applied to all people within the group was low compared to the non-heroic New Englanders that they were fighting. So I think there's a correlation. It's working on that Dread Grace project. It's really about that. When you look at most Aboriginal societies, except for New Guinea and Australia, you see very little in-group violence, but then you see this hyper-violent aspect where they're going after other groups. So when you had the English and the Indians run into each other, you got one group with zero in-group violence, and they're hyper-violent to other groups. And then you have the English, who have a very high level of in-group violence where they're executing their own people. This is what got Captain Cook killed, by the way. And they're prone to negotiate. They got all their land through negotiation, basically. They would kill the Indians at some point later if they didn't get them to drink themselves to death. But there's no point where the English fought their way onto American soil. They always made a deal with a host tribe. who they supplied with better weapons than the other tribes had, and then worked it from there. It was so it's all negotiation, all outward negotiation. So when you look at those ass-kissing junior politicians going up there to have their pictures taken, you're seeing that old English preference for negotiation with the other and abandonment of your in-group, your family. So I think that's just really deep into psychology. And I don't know how that witch's brew comes out of the British Isles in England because you had so many groups interacting there for so long. But it was the case. Captain Cook was accepted as a demigod by the Hawaiians. Yet when somebody stole a nail, he insisted. Yeah. Now they're heading out. They're welcome to Harm City. Yeah. He insists that these Polynesian warriors be beaten. Well, they would only do that to an enemy that they captured prior to his ritual execution. They would never do that to a member of their own group. So that made the expedition ended in disaster on that note. So we've got something really unnatural in civilization as a whole. It's not just the English thing. When the Japanese modernized and took on a lot of European military and social structures, when they went into Taiwan, they had similar clashes with the natives there. And there was actually a period, I don't know how long it was, I think it was less than a year, where the natives were actually defeating the Japanese with Stone Age weapons. And at this point, the Japs had biplanes with machine guns, and they had artillery and rifles and bayonets, and it was an actual war. They had to go in there and fight, and they lost a couple of battles.
Wow.
So I'm not going to say it's English. I just think it's been its most toxic manifestation, and it probably had a lot to do with the technology level, that they got the mercantile industrial technology first, and somehow that magnifies and distorts civilization, and civilization is a domestication matrix.
Yeah, I was thinking that it connects to the idea of a hive as well, and Japan and England or Britain are both small nations that have long history of island nations that have a long history of kind of feudal development. And people don't realize that England and Japan both had like dozens of little kingdoms in there, and that's only slowly did they unify, and one guy, finally ended up in charge of each place. So I think there's some.
That's a great point. The Japanese really admired the British a lot, and they tried to imitate them in their naval. Even though they ended up allying more with the Prussians and later the Germans, they most admired the British. They were actually disappointed that the British were so easily defeated at Singapore.
Oh.
Because they had looked up to them the whole time they were gearing up for their war with the Russians. In the late 1800s, they basically put the British on a pedestal.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
And I hadn't thought of the fact that they were both islands just on the outskirts of these giant
empires.
Right.
Or
so that probably had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, because you have to come up with a system of internal organization, and you have to police your own. It's crowded. I mean, it's not that it's more crowded now than it ever was in those days, but it's you have to have an organization that allows high density living and there was a time in England where a Cornish knight was a sworn enemy of a knight from York or some other. I don't know why in King Arthur's tales they're always making fun of Tristan for being Cornish, but those were not part of the same country. They were totally different people, and they hated each other.
Well, that's where Robert E. Howard has Solomon Kane come from there.
Oh, really? He's Cornish?
Yes. The Devon Moor, I think, was supposed to be where his home was.
Okay, interesting.
So it's a little rocky peninsula. My father-in-law was Cornish. He was descended from Cornish miners, were much sought after. There was tin mining in that part in Cornwall all the way back to Phoenician times, a couple thousand years.
Yeah, I read about that. They think that now that the name Britain arose from the tin trade with ancient Phoenicia.
Yeah, the voice of Pythias the Greek. I forget the name of the author. Is very good, and he explored that well. All through the 1800s, Cornishmen were sought in America wherever there was a mining. There was a HBO miniseries named Deadwood.
Oh, yeah.
They even have Cornish. They did their research pretty good. They had Cornish miners out there in the Black Hills. There were Cornish miners out in California, and of course there were Cornish miners in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
So, and the English wanted to institute a manorial system under different guises in America. It really was supposed to be a feudal system here.
Yeah,
the way it was set up.
They had governors, and that's what the colonies were. They were like a new.
They called the administration a colony.
Mm-hmm.
The territory was called a province,
and
all the towns were called plantations.
Right, but they were meant to they were modeled on the same land use that they had back home.
Right. Yeah. They. The big hole in it was the fact that these people were able to, if they wished, go and join the Indians or try to strike out on their own and see how they could do. So it wasn't a circumscribed geography there. People could go out to the Appalachians, and most of them didn't fare too well, but they could make a go at it.
Yeah, that's a huge difference, right?
Yeah, so that was the big problem in the system. The idea was to have the Indians guard the Appalachians against the runaways. And that held up for a while, which brings me to this, which was something that was written in 1779 on March 19th. This was written in English.
Let's hear it.
Okay. When a white man kills an Indian in a fair fight, it is called honorable. But when an Indian kills a white man in a fair fight, it is called murder. When a white army battles Indians and wins, it is called a great victory. But if they lose, it is called a massacre, and bigger armies are raised. If the Indian flees before the advance of such armies, when he tries to return, he finds that white men are living where he lived. If he tries to fight off such armies, he is killed, and the land is taken away. When an Indian is killed, it is a great loss, which leaves a gap in our people and a sorrow in our heart. When a white is killed, 3 or 4 others step up to take his place, and there is no end to it. The white man seeks to conquer nature, to bend it to his will, and to use it wastefully until it is all gone, and then he simply moves on, leaving the waste behind him, and looking for new places to take. The whole white race is a monster who is always hungry, and what he eats is land. This was written by Chick-Sitka, elder brother of Tecumseh, to Tecumseh when Tecumseh was still a boy. Now, Tecumseh successfully impersonated white children. Tecumseh looked white. Mm. His father was the war chief Puckinswell, who was an ally of Chief Corn Planter, who looks like the YouTube journalist O'Keefe. These were a mixed race group, the Shawnee, that were in close contact with the whites for 250 years. They were working as slave catchers in the 1600s in Virginia.
Wow.
And Pennsylvania. So they maintained their tribal size for 250 years in the face of, what wiped out the Aztecs in a month. Diseases that they had no immunity to. So obviously, by adopting white people into their ranks, they gained immunity at a certain level, and they continued to adopt them. Now, that sounded like pretty good English to me.
Yeah, it did.
Okay, and this guy's an Indian who was said to have been educated by the Quakers, who ran Pennsylvania, and for whom the Shawnees and the Delaware worked as slave catchers, catching Irishmen. So there's no pictures of this guy. There weren't illustrations done of Chick-Sitka. He was eventually killed in Kentucky or Tennessee. He basically fought his whole life. He was supplanted as war chief by Blue Jacket, who was 100% Dutch. He was a runaway white boy. And that's the guy that took command of the Shawnee after Chick-Sitka, who succeeded his father as a war chief. So there you go. That's pretty good English. He's educated by Pennsylvania Dutch, for whom these fellows also acted as slave catchers. And even though they're up to their neck in the white man's business, they're taking his gunpowder and they're taking his steel and his kitchen knives and everything, they still hate the way the civilized society is. They don't want it coming their way. So they're in this catch-22. They're now using the white man's guns to fight the white man. Half of them are white men, and the other half are mixed race. And they're sending letters to each other in English. I found another letter I'll read sometime from a Cherokee chief to a gunsmith, ordering a gun.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's another one for the White Indians and Yellow Negroes project.
Very good. Do you have an artwork that you want to describe today?
Not today. Not
Okay.
today, because I got hung up with something, and I'll make sure that I get some artwork for the next time. I have a ton of it around here. I want to finish all these history books in the first few months after I retire, in case I can't afford to continue living here, because they require a lot of these books that I have that I'm not just going to be able to carry around or replace electronically. So I'll be picking up my pace on that.
Okay. Well,
Thanks for asking.
Yeah. Well, I guess we can go on. I think the monarchy question is one that we can return to, but...
Well, the reason why I put that reading in right there is that's what these war chiefs were. They were monarchs, and their primary purpose was to stand against the outside world.
Right.
And the elders and the women would make decisions at home, and that depended on the tribe. You had some matriarchal systems. You had patriarchal systems. The Algonquins were primarily patriarchal, but there were some exceptions. But the idea is this is often really he's a crisis leader. He's your crisis manager. Crazy Horse was a crisis manager. Sitting Bull, it was a member of the same tribe. He was a moral leader. He wasn't even a war leader. He wasn't the general people thought. He was a person people went to for advice. So you could use something like this. It would it's essentially chiefdoms give rise to kingdoms.
Right.
And you can see what that is. And there's separation of powers in our system is not really achieved because the different branches, the judicial and the legislative branches, are so tied up in the process of selecting the executive branch and of disposing of the executive branch. So people argue about the judicial aspect, but when you see what's happened with Trump, with him being stalled and stopped by the judiciary, and I think it's obvious that the judiciary eventually will become toxic as well, and also muddy the separation of powers.
Well, do you remember, I think it was Andrew Jackson that said about the judge that he's made his decision, now let him enforce it?
Oh, that's my favorite president right there.
Well, and that's the first thing that President Trump did to redecorate the Oval Office, put his portrait up.
All right.
Well, I think that people think of monarchs as we have the Queen of England, who's this nice old lady that likes to race horses, and or I know Moldbug talked about, I think maybe Liechtenstein or some, one of these tiny principalities in Europe as a very well managed place. But you run into the problem that there's no such person that could manage the 330 million person state of United States, and nobody who could do it, and nobody who would have that connection. It's an organic thing, right? Like you say, it starts with a chief and it rises into a centralized monarch, and that's part of the arc of politics that we see, right? That eventually a monarchy becomes a republic, and then a democracy, and then here we are.
The other aspect of the monarch is to take out the traitors. is not to make the decisions, not even do what as much stuff as Trump is doing with internal politics, or what most presidents do with internal politics. He is supposed to avenge the people.
Yeah.
And Pemmican Speaks, or Ron West's book, where he went over the history of the Blackfeet people and how their lands were taken away. Basically, it was a two-pronged attack. The Jesuits got in tight with the women. Now, the women had a lot of power in that society. So you actually end up with this emasculation from within. And at the same time, the white men of stature that visited and negotiated these treaties, I think Grinnell was one guy, there's an assortment of chiefs. There's different chiefs that might be in power at different times. They cultivate relationships with the ones that are prone to alcoholism and feed them a bunch of liquor and basically do a two-pronged attack. They're subverting the female confidence and their males, protectors, and they're also finding the sellout chiefs, the traitors, which would be like our government making us pay back all the banks after the housing crash.
Yeah.
Okay, now he said that they had walls. You know, he talked to the grandsons of people that were alive back then, and it was the job of certain chiefs to go with their stone axe. I think they were supposed to do it with a stone axe and kill the traitor.
Oh, wow.
That's setting up these things. And I forget how it unraveled, but the combination of the female subterfuge from within, the pressure from the U.S. military, and the fact that they got hit by some kind of flu or illness at about the same time, it just disabled it. You know, so it didn't work out, but it's a picture of something that's really the kernel that turns into kingship, which is the chief, who's essentially a sacrificial figure. This is a guy that's, and the Romans would, some of the Roman generals would actually sacrifice themselves and, you know, swear to die if there was no victory. The devotio, I think they called it. So that's what they're supposed to be, and they're supposed to be able to come home and clean out the corruption if it's there, but not take power. And there was actually a show of that with George Washington, but it was really a theatrical show. He was more of a Clintonian character than that. It was like a cross between Reagan and Clinton.
Oh.
Yeah. So that there's that impulse there. People wanted him to be a king for very good reason, because they could put direct popular pressure on him to try to address some of the abuses of his class. So he decided not to be a class traitor, and he didn't accept the kingship. Okay, so he sold out. That's fed to us as this tale of how great Washington is, letting the people rule. But what he was doing is he was selling out the people to his own class, and he wasn't breaking class loyalty.
That's interesting, yeah, because he basically handed off power to his pals, one after another, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. So that was his job, the man who could have been king, but chose not to.
Well, did you see the story that the King of New York rescued 3 of his fine athletic slaves from China?
He tweeted when they didn't thank him. He tweeted out about it, didn't he?
He did. He said, "I wonder if they will thank me." And then they dutifully read the prepared statements that said, "Thank you, President Trump."
And these guys are supposedly headed to the NBA, and they've all they can do when they go into a foreign country is shoplift.
Yeah, these are the most spoiled, UCLA basketball players. These guys, like we talked about, the college football players that have everything provided to them, including women. So, but they had to go help themselves to some Chinese goods, I guess, and they got nabbed.
Well, hopefully it'll happen again, and Trump will say, "You know what? Thank me ahead of time. Let's see how this goes."
Yeah.
I I love the time. I don't know if you remember this because you're a good deal younger than me. I think it was in the late 80s. It might have been in the early 90s. There was the son of an ambassador or somebody
I
over
remember. Singapore.
in Singapore.
Oh, yeah.
He did something, spray painted some cars.
Spray paint, yeah.
Okay,
Vandalism.
and he was sentenced to a caning. And this was a scandal in America. How could we let these people cane this kid?
Yeah.
And I remember seeing the guy practicing with the cane. He was some kind of martial arts champion, and he had like this 8-foot tall rattan staff, and he's whacking it against the ground.
Were you already stick fighting when that happened?
I don't recall, but I remember thinking, wow, that's going to be a whooping. I mean, that's...
what's the big deal? I got caned hundreds of times as a kid. No, that's an exaggeration, but I thought, come on, just put your game face on, get through it, you'll be all right.
Well, having this guy, I mean, it depends on how they do it, but this would be like making somebody stand there and having Mike Tyson punch him in the gut, I mean, because you're talking about like a professional competence with his cane, and the guy that was doing it was like an Olympic quality athlete.
Yeah.
So, it had to have been horrible, but maybe part of it's just a show. I'd like to interview the guy that got caned.
Yeah, he's out there probably somewhere.
That would be a find for me. I would enjoy that.
Yeah, I remember that story because he probably wasn't very much older than me, and it got a lot of play among the youth at that time.
We've had a very bloody middle of the week.
Yeah, the bartender.
There was the bartender, and he was coming home from the bar where the chief of police used to drink at. That is the premier gentrification zone, longest standing one, South Baltimore, and he was on Lawrence Street. These people came in there raiding in a car, and they got him. They killed that guy.
Wow.
And the day after that, there was a homicide detective in West Baltimore, and he just strikes up a conversation with a guy that he thought seemed to be acting suspicious around the crime scene. And the guy just pulls out a gun and shoots him in the head. This thing that was started under the last regime, this intentional unraveling, it actually, the psycho bitch district attorney actually had a worried look on her face.
Yeah, what are the cops that are left going to do? I remember when you posted that there were only 6 cops at work one day.
Yeah, there was one Saturday for 11 to 5:30, shift.
Yeah. What's the incentive? What's the incentive for going to work?
Yeah, so this is going to be interesting. We're taking bets on the murder bowl.
Yeah, I submitted mine.
Okay.
Is the Thanksgiving weekend a big murder weekend?
Yeah. Yeah, it's usually good, but it's all changed. We no longer have big murder weekends.
Yeah.
It's during the week. As soon as they started those weekend truces, these guys just started changing their hunting hours.
All right.
Yeah, so they should be politicians.
Yeah. I don't know if I wrote you this, but it reminds me, because I used to work in finance, and so at the end of the quarter, everybody's trying to do shenanigans, whether they're trying to get more sales in for this quarter, or maybe if it's been a big quarter, we want to push a few sales out, like stop shipping at the last week. So it reminds me of that. That's what they're doing with their murders. They're like, we have too many Fridays, have too many murders, so let's try to do some more on Thursdays, more on Mondays. It's like it's not saving any lives, right?
No, not at all. I particularly like it when they kill somebody exactly midnight on Sunday.
Yeah.
Which has happened like 3 times.
And do you think that they're fudging that? Do you think that's because the cops could easily roll in at 11:30 and then...
Well, yeah, these people are. This is when the declaration is made.
All right.
And that's a shift team. Yeah. The exact times on they do it at the time of death or at the time at which the body is found.
Yeah, there's room for judgment.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm optimistic, but Chicago is doing fantastic. They're well over 600 kills. But the real body count is the heroin and fentanyl.
Yeah. It's incredible.
I talked to a guy whose wife is a barmaid, and her boss found a dead body in the bathroom. It was their cook. Their cook OD'd in the bathroom.
And you have to be really careful. They say that the first responders are suffering from overdoses because this drug is so powerful.
Yeah, he had the barmaid crawl underneath the bathroom stall and unlock the door from within.
God, no.
To check and see if it was really.
She's not getting paid enough to do that.
Yeah. So that was pretty nasty.
Oh God.
And the other cook, who was was an oppressed individual. His people have suffered 400 years of ruthless oppression at the hands of other people in this country. The other cook just stood there and took pictures of his friend and posted them on social media.
Oh.
And they did their drugs together. They would buy their drugs together out in the parking lot and so on.
Oh God.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So this is the cop bar. This is a bar that's frequented by police and firemen too.
Wow.
So it's and what you're seeing in bars now is drastic changes in the clientele in small periods. You might a certain bar might be targeted by the druggies for like 2 hours. For like 2 hours, you'll see a bunch of stoners in there, and then they disappear.
Oh.
And then you've got regular people in there again shooting pool. So, and again, this is something that I had not observed before. I might be more observant now than I was before, but I think this is also in the nature of a change.
Yeah. Well.
Cheer up. This is eugenic.
It might be, but
just do it yourself, eugenic.
Yeah,
like baking a cake at home.
I think there is definitely a genetic component to the drug issue. Definitely, right? We know from medical research that certain genetic profile of people respond differently to different classes of pain medication. So that's uncontroversial, I think. So certainly, people who are vulnerable to it are being removed.
Okay. The United States has 4.6 of the world's population.
Yeah.
I think we have something like 20% of the prison population worldwide. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
But I do know that we consume 80% of the world's opiates.
Wow.
Now, this is a big number. This isn't just, like heroin shipped in illegally. I remember listening to Dr.
stuff too. Yeah.
Right. I remember listening to Dr. Dean Adele, and he was citing a couple of studies on pain management in Vietnam and the United States and contrasting them. And to get an American through a surgery, it took something like 12 times as much pain medication as it did to get a Vietnamese through a surgery.
Well, I can think of reasons for that, just body size and, I don't know, stuff like that. But if you think about 80% of the world's opiates and you think of a person like me or you who's not using any, that means that the people who are using are really using a lot, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you can't walk into a room without running into a pill popper or a heroin addict.
Yeah.
They're out there. But psychologically, these have to be our weakest people, right? So.
Yeah.
So what's the matter with them all ODing? Why is it a tragedy?
It's a tragedy for someone, for more than one person. That struck me when you were on the jury, that you said neither the victim nor the perpetrator had anybody in court.
Right.
Just think of that person who's so alone.
Yeah, and that I agree with you. It's a tragedy. It's definitely a tragedy for the dealer because he just lost a customer.
All right, that's
okay.
You've gone too far.
Hey, I personally know people who have done this, have gone down this road, and I see it as a choice.
Yeah, it is a choice. It is. It's a choice, but it still hurts somebody. And when I look at the stories of people that you share, Big Ron, I have John Paul Barber on the blog spot, and Tony Rooster, these people who have been in the drug culture, and who are just surrounded by it, but somehow emerge from it. So there's definitely a eugenic aspect, right? That you guys survived for some reason. Drugs never held appeal for me. You know, I'll put myself in this bucket too. That
Right.
I was definitely exposed. I grew up in a hippie town. Everybody smoked weed, and I tried it a couple times and just never cared for it. So I feel that's probably a genetic advantage maybe that I have. I don't
Maybe.
consider it as part of my character. I just didn't like it, you know?
Well, I do know that there's a certain amount of disdain that people have been close to the drug culture or have been into it even as much as Tony. There'll be a certain amount of disdain for the junkies.
Yeah.
But it never gets to the level of just dismissing them like garbage.
No.
I'm on the border of being guilty of that.
But you've been exposed to more than average.
Yeah.
It gets desensitizing.
Three more cop sirens in the background right now. Yeah. They're going at high speed somewhere. So the boys are keeping at it. Now, the kingship issue. I want to look at it again in the future in the context of religion instead of politics. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good. I will note that for the future.
Okay. I have to do more reading before that.
Okay. Did you choose an artwork to share with us as well?
What I'd like to do is change the subject matter from the history and give a description of a living picture, which was my grandson's deep suburban first grade classroom on grandson's day. And it also cover the illustration that he sketched as part of one of his workshops. The way this class is organized, there's a maximum of 30 students. There is a carpet on the floor with 30 colored squares where the students gather and sit cross-legged before this very large computer monitor that works as an interactive chalkboard that the teacher stands next to. She runs them through a little lesson. She gives them their assignment, and then she sends them back to their tables. They don't have desks. There are desks along the walls with computers at them, and there I saw 3 assignments when I was there. The class consisted of 15 Caucasian children and 1 black child. And there was a teacher and a teacher's aide, so the student-teacher ratio is really good. I like some of the things they did, like having the children take attendance and then 2 of them going down the hall and delivering that to the principal. There were a lot of little neat things like that I thought were good. I liked the way that the language was taught. Not that I would know how to teach language. I failed to learn it, so it seemed like something that I could have grasped. So I like that. 2 of the projects I'll discuss. One is their second book of first grade. It's a 32-page colored picture book it's called Sun Box. And then there was a poem that was a Veterans Day poem. It was very jingoistic. Jeremy Bentham would have approved of it. So this isn't some hyper-liberal setting we have here. They were celebrating Veterans Day. When the children don't come back to the square on time, after half of the children are there, this teacher will start a chant, we are waiting for our readers on the rug. And they repeat this until all the readers are seated. This song, the use of song and chanting led by the teacher with these children, I really didn't like it. I never recall anything like this, even in music class when I was a child. Eyes on the learning. Eyes on me. She uses a lot. The black child was probably in the top 5 as far as his immediate grasp of the material, but he had very little impulse control. And since the other students were so well behaved, the white children were so well behaved, their example and the teacher's good handling of this child actually enabled him to grasp the subject. I could imagine this falling apart as soon as his number reaches 3. The other thing that was an absolute shame was the Sunbox story is about a slave boy. He's a black slave boy in pre-Civil War Southern America, the Southern United States. And the first act is him watching this tree, the leaves falling on him, and the leaves separate from the tree, and the leaves are lost and irretrievable. And this is the metaphor for the child being separated from his parents, the parent being the tree. The master is sick. The master has been good to him. He thinks he's going to be freed when he goes to see his master. His master instead tells him that he's giving him to his son, and he wants him to be a good slave for his son. The boy is disturbed about this. But when the master tells him this, he does not thank the master, because a slave would never thank a master for anything he did for him except for free him, because slaves do not lie. Slaves did not lie. Since the slave boy is unhappy, he must show the slave master that he is unhappy. Well, this is the exact opposite of what really happened. Slaves had it so bad under much white ownership that they would fake tears very often for sympathy of a sick master. When they went to a master's funeral, particularly one that had been cruel, they would cry their eyes out and pretend. They had systems. They would even use cayenne pepper for working up tears so that the new slave master wouldn't take it out on them. So this lie is being taught as part of this novel, and I wonder if it's to lionize and martyr the black slaves of the past, or if its purpose is to let the child know that if he feels like a slave, not to hide it, to make sure he steps up and tells whoever his master is. So I don't know which way to go with that metaphor. Maybe it cuts both ways. It's not accidental, not the way it was written, and not the way the teacher focused on it. Because the teacher, when she gets a book like this, she gets a worksheet to go along with it, to give emphasis, so she knows where to give emphasis on things. This teacher announced, who I thought she was a doll, by the way. I would induct her into the harem if I were the Khan, that is. She informed the students that they would be coming back to this book. This was only 2 pages of this book. For the next 4 months, their core study in English class, their core study was going to be this book about this little black slave boy. That's what these children are going to be exposed to, not in social studies, but in English class. And I look at these children, and there's a sweet little black boy who is really trying hard to learn and fit in, and everybody's trying to help him. And I look at a group of white children, probably 5 of which are going to be stricken with irreconcilable guilt that they can't possibly get off their chest because of the way it's formed today. And this boy is going to be given an excuse to fail at his every effort. And this is like engineered destruction of these young minds when I see this. So I survey the class. Of course, the black child doesn't have a grandparent present. In the main hallway grouping, I noticed that the percentage of black children was much greater than the percentage of their grandparents that showed up compared to the white grandparents showing up for the white children. So even in this upper middle class neighborhood, you don't have black family support of the children. They're just farmed out to the system at a higher rate than with the whites. Now, the whites, there's not a lot of white family support for the children either, but neither one of these are the most troubling aspects. For the 16 children in this class, this was a high participation rate as compared to the school overall, because I think a full third of all the students that came for the entire grade were in this one 16-person class, as far as the grandparents go. There were 9 of us in this class. First, for Trey, my grandson, there was myself and my mother, grandfather and great-grandmother, and then his grandmother showed up later towards the end of my stay there. For the other boys in this class who outnumbered the girls by 1, there was not one single grandparent there. The other 6 grandparents were there for girls. Nobody was there for boys. I've seen this in martial arts. I've seen this in boxing. If you got a boy, he gets dumped off at the door. If you got a daughter, the parents come in and they ask questions and they want to be involved. If it's a commercial setup and you quote a price to a parent for a girl, it's no issue. They'll say, "Is that all?" You quote a price for a boy. half the time they walk out, the other half of the time they try to negotiate down on the price, even while the child's standing there and his future is being debated and auctioned down. The thing that I was really proud of was that there was this pretty little girl with a whole lot of long brown hair that seemed to be an outcast in the group. She didn't sit with the other girls, and she and Trey were the only people that sat at their table, and these are 5-child tables. And so they're both kind of the loners. When it came time for the grandparents to help with the work, when the children come back to their table, I walked up to him and I said, "Would you like me to help you?" And he looked at me and he said no. And then he didn't work with the other girl, but they looked at each other up and down. And then when her grandfather came in, he seemed like a very nice fellow. He was about my age. She ran into his arms. You could tell this girl's in love with her granddaddy. And she did everything with him for the rest of the period over by where he was sitting. And then Trey looked at me and I walked over. I said, "Would you like me to help you now?" And he said yes. So whether that was his ego trying to impress the girl, or whether it was his concern for her, I approve. One of the projects was to write a sketch of a relationship. She gives the definition of a relationship. And the children all sit at their table to write their sketch. I was curious to go up and see what his sketch was, even though it was something that he didn't want my help. When he was done, I walked up there. And what he had sketched was this lower space, a lower plane in the center. He was to the left of the lower plane. Then there's a slightly higher plane to the left. Next to him, he's very close to this, with this lineup of these 4 little children that are stick figures with appropriate colored hair. One of them, the one closest to his figure, which is yellowed haired, he's blonde, is the brown hair girl. She's closest to him. These 4 children are named and they're placed slightly above him, next to him. And then all the way to the right, there is a raised throne, this very blocky throne. And there is a female figure, which he designates by this wedge-shaped dress on the stick figure, a wedge-shaped dress bottom, and just a lot of hair. And the teacher is named. So what he's constructed there in this illustration, and mind you, he's told me numerous times that he really hates school. What he's constructed there is an image of his class. And his class is structured very much like a traditional agrarian religious experience where the low people, the little people, stand out on the plain and they look up at the idol, at the priest, at the preacher, and at all the symbology of the cult. As I told him, I thought that was very good, and it made me confident in his grasp. As I left the school, which will remain unnamed, I looked at their mission statement. Remember the poem of the Veterans Day poem was very jingoistic. It was by a lady named Jessica Hawkins on Veterans Day. And it was a Veterans Day prayer. It even says it's a prayer. Again, this is not militantly liberal here. The last sentence in the mission statement for the school in the lobby, I read between eyeing up the doll baby mulatto principal. The principal's a baby doll. I thought she was great. She was in a long, tight-fitting brown dress, which was a very dignified sort. It says this: "We are responsible for reaching our fullest potential so that we are prepared to contribute to our global society in the 21st century." There you go. That was Grandparents Day in the deep suburbs, 30 miles north of Harm City.
Well, I'm here with Rory, and she's still kind of crying, but that last quote was kind of chilling.
Yeah. Yes, it was.
Wow. Our global community, or global society.
Yeah, and the thing with the little slavery book is just tragic.
Yeah, it's poison. It's poisoning their minds.
So I was really horrified.
That concludes episode 19 of the Crackpot Podcast with LaFond and Lockhart. I wanted to add something here that a couple weeks ago, PR commented on one of the podcasts that maybe James should interview me for one of the episodes. And we tried a little bit of that, but I don't know what to tell you, PR. I think that I prefer not to be interviewed very much at this stage. So I appreciate your interest. I'm going to have to decline your request for an interview, but I do appreciate it. Thanks a lot, PR, and everybody. We'll see you next time.
We'll meet again under the sun every 12